So thank you for still being here. It's actually not a bad place to be because it's like way warmer than most other places around here right now. So you made smart choices, and it's not just warmer, it is also the place with a considerable amount of intellectual firepower. On this panel, this is the panel on solar geoengineering and intergenerational justice. There is in fact so much intellectual firepower here that my main role as the moderator is to be quick and otherwise stay out of the way. So we're going to have on this group Marion Hudekin of Colorado College, Luca Stancic of this very place here, Harvard University, and Steve Gardiner, who is already in position over there of the University of Washington. They all work at the intersection of ethics, political philosophy, environmental philosophy, and with that said, Steve, over to you.
Thank you. So I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for their kind invitation to be here today. We've been asked to introduce our approach to solar geoengineering and especially to the intergenerational dimension. Since we only have 8 minutes, which is basically impossible for a philosopher, and I have jet lag as well, I'm just going to make a few quick remarks. So first, I want to say that discussion of the ethics of solar geoengineering already has a substantial history and an extensive literature. So it's worth being aware of and paying attention to both of these things. One thing to notice is that, oh, went too fast. One thing to notice is that a range of values are thought to be important, and this list gives a number of them that are discussed in the literature. My main point here is simply that there are a lot of them, and it's probably an incomplete list. So, beware having too narrow a focus when thinking about the ethics of geoengineering. Now, in the substantial literature, many people have contributed. I shocked myself by producing this slide, which I was going to put at the end originally, but by how many of these things there are, about 20 of them by me, including recently an edited collection that came out of an NSF grant with almost the same title as this conference, The Ethics of Geoengineering and Climate, Justice, Legitimacy, and Governance. Right. One lesson I take from this is for a long time I've regarded geoengineering as a side project, and right at the beginning when I was asked to contribute by commenting on some remarks of the then president of the National Academy at the AAAS. Right at the end of the talk, I told the organizers, well, that was great, but I'm not doing any more of this. I'm not getting sucked in. Apparently, you get sucked in, so be wary of that. On to some more substantive stuff around intergenerational ethics. So a few years ago, I with a colleague proposed a set of principles for governing geoengineering, which I called the Tollgate principles, and the NASM report was kind enough to refer to them. According to the first Tollgate principle, geoengineering should be administered by or on behalf of the global intergenerational and ecological public, and in light of their interests and other ethically relevant norms. As it's the first principle, is maybe already obvious that principle strikes me as foundational. However, it's not clear that it's always treated as such in discussing geoengineering, nor that respecting it will turn out to be politically feasible. And if it's not, that casts doubt on the point of geoengineering. And that's something I think we should pay attention to. One thing the principle highlights is the intergenerational aspect of geoengineering. And unfortunately, in context, the intergenerational dimensions are highly likely to be marginalized or ignored, and in ways that are unethical and often profoundly unjust. The context I have in mind is one of profound political inertia on climate change, which has been mentioned a lot. It is this inertia that's driving many towards geoengineering, yet in my view, we should understand solar geoengineering is subject to the very same forces and challenges that have hindered conventional climate policy. So what hinders conventional climate policy? Well, for about 20 years, I've been arguing that a central part of the climate problem is it's what I call a perfect moral storm. It brings together a number of factors that challenge our ability to respond ethically. It throws down the gauntlet to us as ethical agents, if you like. I've also long argued that according to the perfect moral storm analysis, the emergence of solar geoengineering is predictable and indeed likely. The perfect moral storm is an evolving tragedy. It may start with inaction and denial, but things then move on. So, what insights might the perfect moral storm analysis provide about the emergence of solar geoengineering and how we should understand the ethics of it? Well, two central elements of the perfect moral storm analysis seem especially salient: the intergenerational storm and the problem of moral corruption. According to the intergenerational storm, a central feature of climate change is that it's a tyranny of the contemporary rather than, say, a traditional tragedy of the commons or prisoner's dilemma. Now, a tyranny of the contemporary is a kind of collective action problem that plays out over generations. To illustrate it in very simple form, imagine a sequence of generations where each group takes benefits for itself, but in doing so imposes severe harms on all of its successors. Under many circumstances, this pattern of action would violate any reasonable norms of justice, and in the climate case, high consumption emissions seem to fit the pattern, especially when they involve luxuries. A second key feature of the perfect moral storm is the problem of moral corruption. Given the temptations involved in other storms, including the temptation to pass the buck to the future described in the tyranny of the contemporary, it seems likely that those with the power to act will be vulnerable to distorted framings of the climate problem itself, and especially to distortions that facilitate then continuing to pass the buck to the future in ways that suit their interests or purposes. Now, I've long argued that these two problems, the tyranny of the contemporary and the problem of moral corruption, persist with geoengineering. And one general issue there is that there's a profound threat, of what I call generationally parochial geoengineering. That is geoengineering that's dominated by the narrow generation relative concerns of a given generation engaging in the intervention without due consideration for wider concerns, including especially those of later generations. So, for example, we might see a selection bias towards geofixes that hold off the worst for, say, 50 years, and then are indifferent to or fail even to investigate negative effects thereafter. And elsewhere in some work in progress, I've been arguing that the threat of GPG is not only predictable, but also that there's some early warning signs that it's manifest. I've also claimed that there are sometimes signs of moral corruption in the way we talk about geoengineering that suggest a generational bias. One upshot of this is that we should resist various forms of exceptionalism about geoengineering. And one thing which I think I already mentioned in this conference is the idea if we're in an emergency situation, there are more things that should be on the table than solar geoengineering, including things like consumption restrictions, possibly population incentives, climate lockdowns, or sorts of things if things are really that bad. Now, in closing, we were asked to mention a few big points that we think deserve more attention. So, how am I doing for time? Okay. So a few of the things that I would highlight, obviously I've written a lot about this, so I could highlight a lot of things. But for these purposes, first, I'm concerned about the threat of what I call an intergenerational arms race. So if a given generation deploys, say, solar geo to protect itself against impacts it regards as unacceptable, this may have knock-on effects for future generations that make life worse for them. And in response, a successor generation may also deploy other kinds of climate intervention to protect itself against those effects, even if those make life worse for its successors, and so on. Second central issue is that I think the second issue is about the interest of self-defense arguments surrounding geoengineering and the limits of those self-defense arguments. In particular, I would highlight the risk that multiple agents will all be able to plausibly appeal to self-defense as giving them the right to geoengineer or counter-geoengineer or engage in serious resistance to the geoengineering or counter-geoengineering of others. So this suggests the possibility and perhaps even the likelihood of a nightmare scenario that may plausibly be seen as more dangerous than many forms of climate change that solar geoengineering might be employed to prevent. Thus, you might say, solar geoengineering might not be the lesser evil, but rather provoke a greater evil that we should be concerned with, and more concerned with preventing even perhaps than some kinds of evils from some levels of climate change. Third, I'd like to mention something that's been, I think, hovering in the background we haven't really talked about, the profound politicization of nature implied by solar geoengineering and the serious issues involved in any agent seeking to take control of the entire climate system, one that will have serious global and intergenerational implications. I think issues of justice and political legitimacy are central here, but I don't think we've really grappled with them in this venue. And fourth and finally, when it comes to governance, I've been arguing for a decade or more for a general global constitutional convention focused on future generations. This would be a deliberative forum designed to recommend institutions that will confront the tyranny of the contemporary. I'm currently writing a book on this. Obviously, the GCC faces initial skepticism, and I have pushed back against that skepticism in a number of articles, but at least seems to me the right kind of thing to be discussing, and I think implicitly and maybe occasionally a little bit explicitly, it has come up in this forum as being the right kind of thing to be talking about. Thank you very much.
Lucas.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here with Marion and Steve, two of my heroes on this topic. So we were asked to say a few words up front about how we think about geoengineering prospects from the perspective of intergenerational justice. So let me just start very briefly to say something about how I think about intergenerational justice questions in general around climate change. How should you approach questions like how quickly should we reduce the global level of greenhouse gas emissions? What would be the optimal temperature stabilization target, and so on, from specifically the perspective of justice, intergenerational justice? I think that the dominant way of thinking about these questions that's implicit in the way that policy people think and write about it, and integrated assessment models and so on, is mistaken, because it's a form of consequentialist, sum total utilitarianism at bottom that tells us to maximize an additive sum welfare function across time, and such approaches ultimately have very unacceptable implications. They tell us to grow the population and indeed to starve the present for the sake of a larger stream of benefits to distant future generations, and they avoid those implications only through ad hoc devices that are ultimately doing all of the work and generating reasonable conclusions, but really are shedding no light on how we should think about really systematically approach the problem. So I think the right way to think about the issue is in a nested intergenerational chain model, in a non-consequentialist way that understands the ultimate duty of intergenerational justice, or principle, as being not the duty to maximize the sum of happiness or welfare now and indefinitely into the future, but rather to create and ensure the continuation of just institutions that satisfy people's present, at any given time, most fundamental rights and vital interests. Okay? Things like the rule of law and education and a stable environment and so on. So what that duty comes to in the case of climate change mitigation, et cetera, is to put in place all and only those restrictions on existing rights and freedoms that are necessary to prevent even more serious restrictions having to be put in place later to ensure for everyone who ever lives all of the rights and claims picked out by the theories of social and international justice. In other words, intergenerational injustice consists essentially in kicking the can down the road. That's to say, failing to put in place restrictions on existing rights and freedoms that are necessary to prevent even more serious sacrifices having to be made later for that very purpose of enacting justice. And that's exactly what today's most powerful actors are now doing, and it's exactly how what was done by the people who were in charge 30 and 40 and 50 years ago to us. They failed to make changes to energy systems that, though they would have been costly and socially disruptive, would have been a lot less burdensome to undertake in the time that was then still there to prevent catastrophe. Instead, they chose to indulge much less urgent interests in consumption and accumulation, and left us in a much more dire situation. And in turn, power holders today are doing the very same thing to the children born around the world yesterday. They're indulging relatively less important interests in accumulation and consumption, rather than accelerating the energy transition, ensuring that even more burdensome steps will be required for that purpose in the future, else the world eventually collapse from a runaway climate crisis. So the next thing, that's sort of general approach, my general take on how to think about intergenerational justice, what it essentially consists in. The next thing to say is that from this perspective, geoengineering, solar geoengineering, may well become a permissible and perhaps at some stage even a required response to the accelerating climate crisis, assuming for the moment that powerful actors will otherwise act rightly in the future, or at least be forced to do so, an assumption that I will question in just a moment. So to see why geoengineering may become permissible, I think, and perhaps even required, I think you just need to appreciate three things, or at least this is what leads me to this conclusion. First, the unforgiving math of global warming and the enormity of the global energy challenge. Second, the fact that absolutely dire environmental and social consequences are already locked in. And third, that in light of the first two facts, there will be an increasingly dire adaptation mitigation trade-off that societies face in the future that could in principle be made a lot less bad by solar geoengineering. So first, the enormity of the challenge. This is the only thing that I'll just point to. I mean, sometimes people just forget about how simple but tragic the facts here are. But the temperature will continue climbing and stabilize at a high plateau until we stop adding anything net to the atmosphere. But we are not anywhere in this world at present. Every year we continue to add more CO2 and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere than the year before. So we're actually on the accelerator in this section of the graph. And yet, reducing emissions to zero quickly looks like a very difficult and possibly technically impossible challenge in the next few decades, as many people expect this to happen. So you all know this, but I'll just mention it quickly. Aviation beyond 1,000, we talked about planes, but aviation beyond 1,000 miles, so all transatlantic travel is presently technologically infeasible and likely to remain so for many decades. Long-distance oceanic shipping is also very, very difficult to decarbonize. Industrial heat processes for things like steel production and ammonia production for fertilizer require enormous amounts of combustion. If you tried to replace all of that combustion with hydrogen produced by electrolysis, you would need a staggering increase in electricity demand generation globally. And yet, the sources of that electricity generation also look hard to come by. Most of the hydroelectric good sites around the world have already been found and exploited. There are difficulties with truly scaling up wind and solar energy to provide all electrical demand, including this new demand. Wind, for example, if you really tried to put in place continental scale wind farms, that itself would have a warming effect, because it turns out that continental scale wind farms would mix the boundary layer of the atmosphere. And so if you decarbonized US electricity generation through wind, the mixing effect would produce a surface temperature warming effect of something on the order of 1/4 of a degree Celsius from the winds mixing the heat. That is a large amount, in context, a large amount of heating. It's equivalent to decarbonizing the global electricity sector, the warming that would be reduced by decarbonizing the global electricity sector through some other method. Solar, as you all know, also has its limitations. It requires a lot of land, and some parts of the world simply can't be decarbonized using solar. It's, for example, not going to work in places like Canada, where there's just not enough sunlight, and the intermittency problem generates the grid storage energy buffer problem. So a huge amount of mining needs to take place. The last analysis of this that I read is that in order to simply meet the demand for copper that's projected, never mind decarbonization issues, over the next 30 years, humanity will need to mine more copper than has been mined in the history of human civilization to date over the next 30 years. But if you wanted to create a temporary buffer to store, let's say, a month's worth of electricity, to really remove coal or natural gas generation in the electricity sector, you would have to have something like 200 years of annual copper production simply to actually get the buffer made. So I think there's lots of other things to be said here, but I'll just say, looking into the nature and scale of the global energy challenge suggests to me that it's implausible to think that humanity can avoid a 2 degrees temperature increase in a short period of time without significantly reducing population or global energy consumption or both. And indeed, the truth is, as we also heard earlier today, that the aerosol effect of getting rid of coal plants and soot, we already know that aerosols at present are masking about 0.7 to 0.9 degrees Celsius of warming. So if someone were to wave a wand today and get rid of all fossil fuels, the 1.1 degrees that you see there would jump to 1.7 to 1.8 degrees pretty quickly. So, of course, this is going to have increasingly serious effects that we are already witnessing. 3 years ago, a year's worth of rain fell on a Chinese city over the course of 2 days, a single weekend. 2 years ago, an entire section of Germany was just leveled by a single flood event. Something like 100 square kilometers just taken downstream with buildings and trees and so on that will take actually decades to rebuild in a very wealthy country. These kinds of events, I think, are going to be frequent and increasingly devastating, and will lead to increasingly larger amounts of deaths happening, especially from heat waves in India in not the distant future, but really in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So at that stage, the prospect of solar geoengineering as a method will start to loom large for the following reason. The trade-off between actually devoting resources to the scale of the energy transition needed and the resources that societies will increasingly have to expend to adapt to and to rebuild destroyed infrastructure, destroyed dams, destroyed houses and cities from supermassive storms and floods. The 2/3 of the Indian population at present who are soon going to be exposed to life-endangering heat on a regular basis but don't yet have air conditioning. Call this the air conditioner problem. The more warming there is, the more electricity demand there is to generate the adaptation technology that's necessary to help people survive, but these are resources that are then taken away from the needs of actually building a clean energy infrastructure, high-voltage transmission lines, and replacing all of the technological stock that presently needs to be replaced that is connected and depends upon fossil fuels. In that world, it starts to become not perhaps rational, but perhaps even morally urgent to put in place some mechanism to make the costs of adaptation and dislocation and disruption and death lower so that you can devote more of the resources available to accelerate the energy transition for the next period. However, that conclusion does not by itself follow once you weaken the assumption that actors who will have their hands on the reins will use the technology precisely to reduce the costs of adaptation in order to accelerate the energy transmission. But as we just heard from the last talk, we know that it's the very same actors who have been slowing the energy transition and who have been dragging their heels and engaging in the injustice of kicking the can down the road, who will also have their reins on the whatever the metaphor is here, the hands on the steering wheel. They're going to be in charge of the process of deploying the technology. It's the U.S. Defense Department, which is at the same time the single largest corporate emitter of fossil fuels other than states themselves, that will be developing the technology. And there'll be a range of conflicts that we can anticipate around both the development, questions about deployment, questions about what level, how much radiative forcing to offset, how to deal with unintended consequences, mishaps, perhaps shifting weather patterns that people wrongly or rightly attribute to the deployment of the solar geoengineering technology. And the thing that I think from an intergenerational perspective should keep us up at night the most, sort of taking a long view, once a solar geoengineering program is up and running and is offsetting a significant amount of radiative forcing against the background of continuing to add to the stock of emissions, it becomes vital to continue that program for a very, very long time, because a termination shock of more than 6 or 12 months could lead to an enormous boomerang effect in the temperature offset, which would have devastating environmental and further consequences. And yet, should we really assume that in the future there will be no significant global conflicts between the major powers that disrupted transatlantic trade, transatlantic communication, exchange, diplomacy, and so on for large parts of the 20th century? Looking around the world the last few years and the growing animosity between the United States and China, the fact that we are presently in a new hidden Cold War with Russia, and so on, should give us pause. And anyway, I'll just finish. I think this is the way to, ultimately, this is where all the hard questions lie. Once you lift the assumption that geoengineering will be put in place or contemplated by actors who will otherwise be acting rightly.
Marian.
Okay, thanks. So thanks to my co-panelists and thanks to everyone for having me here. It's really been a pleasure to interact with everyone and just learn. So I want to talk, we were asked to, I think, briefly provide our theory of intergenerational justice and then explain how that sort of bears on solar geoengineering and its risks. So that seems like a big task, and I'm not going to try to tackle that but in any kind of full way, but I am going to try and give you some sense of my orientation to this problem. I think the risks of what Stephen described as generationally parochial geoengineering are pretty significant. And I'm actually really concerned about the current structure of solar geoengineering research and how that might lead to forms of deployment that are parochial in multiple ways. So that don't take seriously sort of a broad concern for the well-being of current and future generations of people and non-human beings. So I guess I come to this in thinking about not just intergenerational justice, but intergenerational ethics and the need for research that takes seriously both. And I make a distinction between intergenerational ethics and intergenerational justice, not because I think that justice is not important. Justice is critical, but I think ethics is broader. I think sometimes when we, dominant discussions of climate justice and intergenerational justice, there are some things that are left out. And so I'd first say that the way we talk about justice is often kind of narrow and tends to focus on distributive justice within and between generations. So we're thinking about, there's like, how are we going to divide up climate harms or distribute climate harms, like globally, sort of in the near term, and also like across generations. And so Steve's talk about intergenerational buck passing as sort of like externalizing climate harms to the next generation. But I think first of all, there are a lot of assumptions built into discussions of of distributive justice, assumptions about what it is we're dividing up and what matters to divide up that I think are sometimes limited and problematic. So maybe people aren't only concerned about physical climate impacts, but also about agency, also about the nature of our relations with one another. And those are maybe things that can't just sort of easily be distributed, or there are other things that need to be distributed beyond sort of physical climate impacts. So that's one thing. So I think if we're going to think in terms of a justice lens, it would be helpful to think in terms of multiple dimensions of justice, not just distributive justice, but also procedural justice, who's involved, how decisions are made, and also justice as recognition. So there, I think Deborah McGregor said earlier, there's sort of problems with representation. And then there's also, I don't know exactly the words, but it's something like, even when you're there, you're not there, or something like that. And I think what I took Professor McGregor to be saying is that even when people are in the room, that doesn't necessarily mean that their voices are heard or their perspectives are taken seriously, or especially perspectives that sort of challenge the dominant background assumptions through which a conversation is being framed. So I think those dimensions of justice are really critical. We need to move kind of beyond, in my opinion, the distributive justice alone frame. And then also consider intergenerational justice and ecological justice, which I think is not a sort of common way of thinking about justice, even though the tollgate principles that Steve has worked on mentions this ecological dimension, and proposals for multi-species justice also take that lens in relation to climate change. So I think expanding the dimensions of justice would be a good step in the right direction, but I think we also need to go beyond just a justice lens and think about intergenerational ethics. And the reason I think that's important is because I think that the way I think about intergenerational ethics, it includes attention to the character and quality of our relations with one another and with the broader world. And it's not only about like the fairness dimensions of those relations, it's just like, what is it to be in good relation with one another? Intergenerational ethics from this perspective includes attention to the character and quality of our relations with present and future beings and the world from like an extended temporal perspective. I think that taking this perspective could help disrupt intergenerational buck passing, because people would be thinking differently about their relation to other generations. Instead of sort of thinking of generations as discrete and in competition with one another, we might think of ourselves as members of communities that are extended in time and as engaged in a sort of shared multi-generational project of thinking about how to promote flourishing for all. Okay, that's like really idealistic, right? I know that's sort of like highly philosophical idea. So I just, in my last few minutes, I just want to think about like, what would this mean for solar geoengineering? And I'm going to assume, for the purposes of this talk, that solar geoengineering research is likely to continue, whether publicly funded or privately funded, and so on. And that if it's going to continue, it would be a good thing if it were differently structured than it currently is. And so my worry is that the current structure of solar geoengineering research is very narrow. So there's a huge concentration of research in a small number of countries. Sakina Jinnah pulled some numbers on this a few years ago and found that the vast majority of research is concentrated in 10 countries, with more than 70% of the 375 publications she pulled from a Web of Science search having authors in the US and the UK. 70% authors in the US and the UK. And then even where representation is broader, voices may not be genuinely heard and engaged. So I know people like stories, so I'm going to read a brief quote, and then I'll try to pull some of these things quickly together. So here's a story that I take from Wiley Carr from his experience observing a geoengineering conference some years ago. At the beginning of the conference, a scientific primer was provided for participants not familiar with the topic. The presenter, a natural scientist from the UK, provided model outputs in the form of 4 maps as key evidence for why he and his contemporaries in the US, Canada, and Europe were taking certain geoengineering proposals seriously. During his presentation, one of the few participants from a developing nation pointed out that the maps only looked at 2 parameters, surface temperature and precipitation. This was concerning to him because many of the people in his country in Africa depended on fishing for their livelihoods, and these models were not taking into account changes in ocean temperature or currents that could be detrimental to such livelihoods. The response from the presenter was that, yes, there are many uncertainties that still needed to be examined by scientists and more models that needed to be developed. However, this individual from Africa, himself a climate expert with 20 years of service on the IPCC, said that his concern was not about the model itself, but the assumptions and ethics behind it. The exchange continued, and the scientists from Africa further questioned the premises of the model as well as the reliability of Western scientific assessments in benefiting people in less developed countries. American scientists then responded, arguing that the whole point of geoengineering was to benefit developing nations. So as Carr goes on to explain, the American climatologist pointed back at the map and indicated that we essentially have to choose between a world with runaway climate change or a world with geoengineering, and then posed a question to the room, which world would you choose? The climate scientist from Africa responded that he would choose the ungeoengineered world. And the American climate scientist assumed that his counterpart had either misunderstood the graphics or the question, and so he re-explained them both. At which point, the African scientist again indicated he would choose climate change over geoengineering. Right. Okay, so, I mean, I think this is an example of misrecognition, like where it's like, oh, you don't get it, let me just explain it to you a 5th time, right? Like, eventually you'll understand, right? Okay, so why does this matter for intergenerational ethics in relation to geoengineering? I think the reason is because I think that lack of representation and lack of recognition is a risk for both present and future generations in relation to SG research. And right now, we have very limited conceptual, legal, and institutional resources for thinking about intergenerational ethics in relation to this topic. And we're therefore, I think, in danger of thinking way too narrowly about these issues. I think recognition and participatory parity are really critical in their own right as a matter of respect. But in addition, they might introduce frameworks for thinking about intergenerational ethics that aren't present in dominant conceptions. I don't think that we should assume that we have a clear map of the possible ways of thinking about intergenerational ethics that are relevant to the issues at hand. So there's more I can say, but I know I'm over time, so I'll just stop there.
Excellent, thank you all. So it of course speaks to the wisdom of the brains to have this panel on intergenerational justice at the end of this program. There's just a lot of things coming together here, and let me ask you the one question in terms of kind of relating what the 3 of you have now been arguing to some of what's been going on before the last couple of days. So we on multiple occasions have touched on the question of how do we think about the research into geoengineering. And there was one, let me just call it the negative view that said, you know, let's have as little of it as possible. Yeah? So let's just try not to do it wherever we can without creating damage elsewhere. But so basically, no to research in geoengineering. Some people in the room have held that. And then there's the, some more cautiously positive take on that, and typically in conjunction. So yes, we need to do research because we might need it, but if we do that, then we also need to have, the people who need to do research, or who do this research, or the institutions that do it also need to speak up strongly to make sure that, the good kind of use is likely rather than any kind of. So these are kind of 2 views that I think have emerged. Maybe each of you could just relate what you have just, the way you think about the intergenerational dimension to these 2 views. Which of these that leans to more? Maybe just go in that same order again, Steve.
I can say something because I don't know what the answer to the question is, but that's to say I don't know whether I think that we ultimately should advocate against continuing the research or ramping it up or something in between. But I do have views about mistaken ways of thinking about that question. And so I think it's just fundamental to make a distinction here between the background motivational assumptions that you're you're asking the question on. So ultimately, are you asking, when you say, should we do research into geoengineering, and should we allow it, or incentivize it, or fund it? Are you asking a version of the following question: what should we all do, assuming that all of us are motivated to do whatever it is that we all together should in respect of the research and the wider climate global energy challenge? And that's a fun question to ask, but it's not the relevant one because we're not in that world. So really, we ought to be asking versions of the following question: what should some of us do, given that not everyone is well motivated to pursue what it is that all of us together should do in respect of the climate challenge or the implementation or development of this technology? And indeed, given that we know that some of the people in power who will try to use or develop the technology and so on will very likely use it for impermissible purposes. Now, we can have that discussion, but I think it's essential to then ask, okay, who is the subset of us, we, that we're talking about? What is it actually within our action to do? What kinds of foreseeable twisting of our intentions and research programs can we envision, and start thinking very clearly against that background assumption, and not the sort of we the public, we the democratic, universal decision maker. That's not the world that we're presently in. It's that question has simply academic interest, I think.
Okay, Lucas, I'm actually surprised that you're so cautious about this, because based on what you said earlier, I expected you would go into a slightly more affirmative direction when it comes to let's do the research, but let's also articulate, institutional demand. So basically, what I heard you say is there's so many difficulties in the energy transition. It's going to be, very hard to do energy transition in ways that actually avoid using solar radiation management of solar geoengineering. So it's, we'll most likely need it, in which case we need to do research. But then you're worried about what kind of use it would be put to. And so in a way, when, you and I as people working for this university, then what we should think about this institution, if I'm right about what you just said, is that we should actually favor this university doing this, because this is a university with a very loud voice in many ways, so I don't with deep pockets. So we should say, let's do diligent research, but let's also strengthen the debate. Let's do more events like this. Let's do public outreach. Let's yell at everybody in the world about making sure that it gets used the right way. But you were not comfortable going.
That is a form of a reasonable proposal that one would want to start thinking from this perspective. But it doesn't immediately, I think, is not immediately recommended, because, as Steve and Marian have pointed out, it's not implausible to imagine a long-distance future that actually goes much, much worse from an intergenerational perspective with solar geoengineering used, if what happens is it's deployed and the CO2 concentration levels out at 1,000 parts as opposed to 550 or 600 or whatever, and at some stage there's a giant termination shock. So this is, when you're thinking about long-run intergenerational justice, you ought to step back and notice that the implementation of a program will involve committing the modern world to its deployment and continuous maintenance for centuries, and a lot of disruptive things can happen over centuries. And so you got to feed those considerations into this nested question of what it is that you and I, or some of us at present, can make a decision. And we know that some of the people at the university, they're going to have their research drawn on and fed into Defense Department research programs and so on. You can anticipate alternative futures, and then you could ask questions about your leverage points, but also you ought not to overestimate your leverage points and things like that.
Marian, Steve?
Sure. I'm not super. I think it's pretty likely that research will continue in one form or another. And then I guess, so for me, one of the questions is, but I think there is some possibility of affecting the shape that research takes and who's involved and what research on this topic means. I don't think it should just mean research on figuring out how we build, how we build it, how we research that's deployment focused. I think, research needs to should involve, like, could this technology ever be managed over multiple decades in a way that would be well coordinated and reflect some kind of, legitimate process. I mean, there's also the question, I think Annie brought up, a proposal earlier about this. There's also this question of, like, there's this temporal question, right? Like, so people in, 2050, say, like, meet these constraints in terms of approving solar geoengineering. Well, what about people in 2060, 2070, 2080, and so on? I think the reason I'm somewhat optimistic about the prospect of actually sort of shifting the discourse kind of within research and the way in which research is approached and sort of thinking about research in a much more interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary ways. I actually have seen some change within some parts of the community over time that show concern for ethics, justice, social dimensions, political challenges, institutional issues. On the other hand, I'm really worried about this concentration of power, like, among a small number of research groups, and the way in which that can control the discourse and frame solar geoengineering as an easy, cheap fix for the climate problem. And I mean, I think, this is the last thing I'll say, but, like, it's gone from being like, well, maybe we should talk about this, to being, David Keith published an editorial in the New York Times where he sort of said, if you're just focused on decarbonization, then you're involved in a kind of emissions monomania, I think was his term, right? Like this sort of, like, tunnel vision focused on, emissions. That's sort of a shifting the burden of proof in a way that I think is really worrisome, and I don't want a small number of people to control the framing of the discussion.
Yeah, I think it's a very vexed question. I read something recently that that he was on the left, but he liked to be on the right wing of the left. And I feel in terms of skepticism about geo, I like to be skeptical, but maybe I'm closer to the edge where I could take it seriously. Because I think maybe some more research would help. But I think there's a lot at stake here, and reasonable people can disagree. One thing that's clearly at stake that I've emphasized is a lot of the rhetoric and arguments about this are driven by we need to avoid a catastrophic scenario. And I've been trying to argue there's more than one catastrophic scenario to avoid here, and some of the potential catastrophic scenarios involve solar geoengineering or are driven by solar geoengineering, and that's not irrelevant, right? So it doesn't mean that every time you invoke climate catastrophe, you win the argument because you invoke catastrophe. So that thing concerns me, as does, as you all know, the phenomenon of generationally parochial geoengineering. I think that's a real and live threat that will be much more interested in, say, the short 50-year fix, and then pass something worse on to the future. That really worries me. One thing I like to say about geoengineering is there's no it, right? There's not one thing that we'd be researching. There's a range of things, including different technologies, but also even within technologies. Geoengineering to try to enforce 2 degrees is different from 1.5, is different from 2.5. There's a lot of differences there. In terms of, if I were to be persuaded that we should go in this direction, I would think it would have to be accompanied with a kind of moral seriousness that I don't yet see, and that's a deep problem. So if we're really driven by concern for climate catastrophe, then we really have to take seriously not just solar geoengineering. We see these National Academy reports, we see editorials in Nature and Science and other places saying we need to do some research because this is so important. I don't see the editorials and the National Academy reports saying we really need consumption restrictions. Not seeing the ones that say we really need population incentives. I'm not seeing a genuine attempt to say we need every tool in the toolbox. There's already hyper-selectivity about what's in the toolbox. That makes me very nervous about what's going on here. And it also makes me nervous that, it's been said for years, and I very much agree with it, and Annie said it earlier, right? What you'd like to see is a co-evolution of the science and the governance and the ethics. And often I see lip service to ethics and sometimes governance. I'd like to see actual strong engagement.
Yeah. Let me ask you a follow-up on this, Steve, and then actually, Lucas, you want to get in on this also? Then
just wanted to comment on this, but wait.
Yeah, the follow-up is, Steve, you talked about moral corruption earlier. You had it there on the slide. You talked about it briefly, and also moral corruption is a big topic in your book about the perfect moral storm. And if I remember correctly, actually, that book came out now 10 years ago. It's a classic in the field by now. And so you connected to solar geoengineering, right? So it's actually, I think it's your key illustration for what moral corruption might amount to, that we like solar geoengineering too much. Now, the debate about solar geoengineering was a very different one, when you were publishing that book. How has the situation, do you look at this differently now? How is the debate different now compared to when you put this in the book first?
Yeah, good question. Actually, the key illustration in the book for moral corruption is a passage from Jane Austen, which I go on about. But then it follows with the geoengineering discussion. I don't know that I would change much about what I said in that chapter. The chapter is focused on the idea of arming the future, right? So arguments that say we should prepare people a few decades, maybe quite a few decades ahead to geoengineer. I think that's still at the center of a lot of the discussion. I do also consider the idea of arming the present. Like people say, we've already got there, we're already tripping some thresholds. I don't think that makes a dramatic difference. One thing that I've long argued and argue it in the book is that some people think strongly that we will kind of be saved by disaster, that once things get bad enough, we'll get our act together and we'll start taking all these moral concerns and so on seriously. I worry that in a disaster scenario, when things get really bad, we might be at least as bad about the intergenerational buck passing and so on. It might even seem, and in some ways rightly, even more justifiable to us to do bad things for the future because of the stress of the present. And you see this in climate policy often. That what are the first things to go when we hit serious economic, public health areas? Thresholds, well, often it's the climate restrictions start being watered down.
Open discussion here, so it's Lucas, you want to, and then...
Just briefly, I just wanted to underscore that both of the points that, and say that I agree with them, that looking at the scene, I don't see any of the required moral seriousness, and the sort of progress to the contrary in the development of clean energy technology does not provide any evidence of that to me, because globally it looks to me like the pursuit of energy abundance is simply the increase in the available energy supply globally, with rapid fossil fuel development globally and rapid new forms of technology developed. But the one is not replacing the other. It's simply adding to total energy supply. You can see that everywhere. And in some ways, it's making it worse. The natural gas transition, if just 3% from coal, if just 3% of the natural gas out of a fracking well escapes into the atmosphere, it's already equivalent to the impact of just burning coal. But now you freeze that stuff to ship it in liquefied natural gas terminals, and it requires enormous amounts of energy. It makes it worse than simply burning the coal. So that seems to be happening everywhere, and the IRA is just another example of an energy abundance bill and not an energy transition bill. And I just want to say that I also agree with the idea that it's a big mistake to rely on the motivational force of disaster in the future, because the trade-off between societies using resources to accelerate the energy transition and using them to rebuild buildings, to electrify things for air conditioning, but also to keep out all the migrants who are going to come and the debilitating politics that will result when hundreds of millions of people flow northwards and so on. That trade-off will be very, very real. You know, so I think it's also a mistake to think about sort of deploying or developing geoengineering in the context of future disaster. Yeah.